the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Leadership. Well, many of you will probably not be surprised to hear that I've been thinking a lot about leadership lately. But actually, this sermon has been on my heart for a long time, a year maybe even more. I've been thinking about how I could do a better job of explaining to you all in the congregation what I mean when I talk about leadership in the church. Because the thing about leadership is that it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? So if I asked you right now to define leadership, I'd probably get as many different answers as people I ask. There'd be some commonalities, of course, but we all have our own different spin on things. And a problem is that if we actually think to look to the Bible for some lessons in leadership, which I think is a great idea, we can actually start to get kind of intimidated pretty fast, right? Because these characters that jump out in our minds from the stories that we learned in Sunday school as children, they seem so extraordinary. Parting the Red Sea, surviving a lion's den or a fiery furnace, building and rebuilding temples, leading God's people into battle. It's easy to forget that the leaders of God's people back then were actually just like we are now, figuring it out as we go along. And that's why I love today's story from Exodus about Moses, the great leader Moses, right? It helps us to take off our blinders and see a part of the picture that is often too easy to overlook. Moses wasn't perfect. And in fact, despite the fact that he had started out with some humility in his journey with God, it seems by chapter 18 that he's kind of let this leadership thing get to his head a little bit. Now, the idea of shared leadership and delegating should not really have been new concepts for Moses. Number one, he grew up in Pharaoh's court, and I seriously doubt that the Egyptian dynasty was built on Pharaoh micromanaging everything. But more importantly, there's this super interesting story right before this in chapter 17. It's a crazy story about a battle between the Israelites and Amalek. So Moses sends Joshua and his men out to fight Amalek. And then Moses, Aaron, and Hur go up to a nearby hill. It's always important to claim the high ground, right? So there they are, standing on the hill, and Moses raises his arms. And as long as Moses' arms are in the air, the Israelites are winning the battle. But after a while, Moses' arms begin to get tired, right? And as his arms fall, the Israelites begin to lose. And so Aaron and Hur sit Moses down on a rock, and they each take one of his arms and hold his arms up for him so that the Israelites are victorious. Quite a lesson in you can't do everything on your own. And yet here we are just a few hours, days, weeks later, and Moses is acting like it all depends on him, forgetting that the people of God are perfectly capable if he would just teach them some of what he knows, forgetting that there are many leaders out there that he can rely on to help him do God's work. And in fact, it's funny because Moses ends up learning this important leadership lesson from his father-in-law, Jethro, of all people. And what you need to know about Jethro is that at this point in the story, he has been part of God's family for about 30 seconds. Literally, his first confession of faith is 6 verses before this story starts. Before that, he was a foreigner. He was not of the tribe of Israel. And yet, he feels bold enough to give this advice. So to me, this story is a reminder that leaders come in all shapes and sizes and ages. You may lead a group of thousands, and you may lead a group of 10, but you are both leaders. And the length of one's faith is not a determining factor. Jethro exercised this leadership even though he had been a Jew for 5 minutes. Something very important for us to remember as a church that hopefully is always welcoming new leaders into our midst. And one final note on this story before jumping to the Gospel of Matthew. It's important to remember that Jethro did not have an official title. He wasn't elected, he didn't chair a committee or perform, many leadership tasks. But in my mind, he was still a leader. Sometimes leadership is speaking up or asking a question. If God truly puts it on your heart, your leadership moment may only take a few minutes, but it is still a very important contribution. So next I want to jump to our gospel reading from Matthew. And in order to more fully grasp this key moment in the story, it's important to know just a little something about this city of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi was a coastal city. It was outside of Rome proper, but of course in the Roman Empire. It was this lavish vacation spot for the Roman rulers, and of course it was named after Caesar Augustus, the Roman ruler. So by Jesus revealing his kingship here in this city, you can see that he is painting a stark contrast between his leadership and the way that things are currently being run. But beyond that, I think this passage is important for us to focus on today because it reminds us that as leaders of Christ Church, we have a lot of power. I'm focusing particularly on the end of this reading. We, you and I, hold the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Think about that. You and I hold the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Jesus entrusted us, his church, with these keys. And the keys represent all that we need to do God's work in the world. Now, our southeastern Pennsylvania Synod Bishop, Claire Burkett, preached a really fantastic sermon on these keys at our Synod Assembly this spring, and maybe you can talk to Will or Ed about that and see what they remember. She opened with a story about a phone conversation that she heard while getting her car worked on at the dealership. Now, I don't actually know how she heard both ends of this phone conversation. She may have kind of pieced it together. But here's how it went. Woman on the phone. Help! I can't get into my car. My clicker isn't working. Can you send someone to help me? Well, sure, ma'am, we can send someone. But first, let me see if I can help. You said your clicker wasn't working. Have you tried the key that came with your car? I have a key? remember that we have the keys that we need, even when they are right in front of us. Christ gave them to us, and they are all that we need. They may look a little different over the years, but we always have them, even when we don't realize it. Now, of course, this is going to be difficult. Hiding right there in my clicker. We are so used to pushing buttons and being able to control our thermostats with our iPhones that we forget that sometimes the old standbys still work, right? I know that I talk an awful lot about how the church is changing, but that doesn't mean that our work of caring for one another, loving each other, and sharing God's story is completely unfamiliar territory. Now, some among us have the leadership gift of reading tea leaves, of knowing when is the right time to try something new, and when is the right time to pull out something that's been reliable. But in order for one leader to use that gift, we have to have other leaders who are willing to keep throwing ideas out there, even if we aren't swinging at every pitch. And this is exactly why Paul uses the image of the body to teach the church in Corinth about spiritual gifts. For most of you, this is not a new concept. You've probably heard a lot of preachers over the years talk about it many times. We all have a special role to play, and no role is unimportant. If one part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers. But I'm not sure that we always connect giving of our spiritual gifts with the word leadership. Because in fact, I know some of you out there might argue that leadership is a spiritual gift, and so if you don't have that gift, then you aren't a leader. Not so, at least not in my book. Using your gifts, whatever they may be, in service to the rest of the body is showing leadership, because you are setting an example that others can follow. You are faithfully doing your part. As other people see you sharing your gift of hospitality or care and concern or prayer or whatever your gift is, they are encouraged, they are emboldened to share their gifts too. As I mentioned earlier, leadership does not always mean being in charge, being elected or appointed, or having a title. There are many, many ways to lead. And we need everyone. We need everyone's gifts, and we need everyone's leadership. This is always true, but it's perhaps especially true today, as our church and the church in general is in a time of transition. Now, I'll admit that transition can be an especially challenging and scary time to think about leading. But it is also, I think, an incredibly exciting time to think about leading. An exciting time because we get to see the gifts that God has given us grow and change. And we get to laugh and smile and shout with glee when we realize that there was this gift we've had in front of us all along, and we didn't see it. So I hope that in these next few weeks and months, you will all say some special prayers for the leaders of our church, and pray too about your own leadership. remembering that each of you, each and every one of you, is a leader in God's kingdom, equipped with all that you need, if you are brave enough to trust that sometimes God is okay with figuring it out as you go along. Amen.